Life stories can teach us profound lessons about love, family, and the strength to break free from toxic cycles. In this story, Samantha finds herself at a crossroads, facing the betrayal and manipulation of her family, who have always seen her as nothing more than a source of financial support. But when the weight becomes too much, she finally takes a stand and reclaims control of her life. This is her journey of self-discovery, resilience, and the hard truth about what it means to stop enabling those who have always held her back. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to start today's story. The text message from my mother was simple, yet loaded with an unease I knew all too well. Darling, please come over at 7. We have something special planned. I stared at those words, my stomach twisting with a familiar knot of dread. At 33 years old, I had learned that when my mother, Susan, says something special, it usually means trouble wrapped in a pretty bow. I had always been the one to fix things. The one who bailed out my brother's disastrous business ventures, covered my father's endless gambling debts, and refinanced my mother's maxed-out credit cards. All this while maintaining my own career in finance, which they loved to brag about to their friends but secretly resented. In their eyes, I was the reliable one, the person they could always count on when their own missteps spiraled out of control. But tonight, something felt different. The old, familiar pit in my stomach grew heavier as I drove to their suburban home. It wasn't just the typical familial burden I carried, there was something else, something I couldn't yet put my finger on. I arrived fashionably late, just enough to irritate my mother but not enough to set her off into one of her infamous rages. Through the living room window, I could see movement, familiar faces lingering in the background, hushed voices that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't need to be told what this was. It was a surprise party. And yet, the only surprise here was how predictable it had become. Taking a deep breath, I rang the doorbell, steadying my nerves. The door swung open, revealing my mother in all her usual grandeur, perfectly coiffed, with that smile that always suggested she was up to something. Surprise, she announced, and the chorus of voices followed. Family members emerged from various hiding spots, my aunts, uncles, cousins, all wearing smiles that could only be described as shark-like. Circling their prey, I practiced the surprised expression I had perfected over the years, knowing exactly how this would unfold. Oh my goodness, I gasped, letting the words tumble out as I made my way inside. You shouldn't have. It was a lie, of course. But after all these years, the words were as rehearsed as any line in a play. My baby girl, Susan exclaimed, pulling me into a lavender-scented hug that lingered just a beat too long. It was always the same. She played the part of the loving mother, all while I knew she was calculating her next move in the background. 30 is such a special birthday, she said, adding a touch of drama to her tone. I raised an eyebrow. I'm 33, Mom. She waved her hand dismissively. Details. Edmund, my father, appeared with a glass of what looked like an expensive scotch. Here you go, princess, your favorite. But I knew, and he knew, that I had never liked scotch. He handed it to me anyway, as if it was the least I could accept for all the years I had spent saving them from their own chaos. Jasper, my brother, stood awkwardly by the fireplace, avoiding eye contact. He wasn't in on whatever was about to happen, but I could tell from his expression that he was dreading it. And then I saw it. A legal document, placed conspicuously on the coffee table, its corner peeking out from under a magazine. My heart rate quickened, but I forced myself to remain calm. I had seen this all before. This was the start of it, the part where they tried to manipulate me into signing away my rights. My inheritance, my future. Come sit, darling, my mother said, steering me toward the couch. Everyone's here to celebrate you. I looked around the room, family members I hadn't seen in years, all wearing the same artificial smiles. The only face that seemed genuine was Reagan, my best friend. She caught my eye and raised an eyebrow, the silent understanding between us more telling than any words could have been. Before I could even sit down, my mother clapped her hands. Nah, she announced with her usual flourish. Let's start with presents, shall we? The biggest one first. My father, as though on cue, Move the magazine to reveal the document beneath it. I felt my pulse quicken. This was no longer just a birthday party. This was a scheme, carefully orchestrated to put me in a corner and make me feel obligated to comply. I had seen it before. But this time, something was different. I wasn't going to play their game anymore. I picked up the document. Scanning the title, Inheritance Agreement. My stomach dropped. The words were there, in black and white, daring me to ignore them. What's this? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Oh, just some boring paperwork about Grandma Helen's inheritance. My mother said too casually, as if brushing it off. Nothing to worry about tonight. We'll deal with it later. But I wasn't convinced. I knew better than to take her word for it. Actually, I said, glancing around at the expectant faces. I think we should look at this now. Since everyone's here. The room fell silent. My mother's forced smile faltered for a moment before she quickly recovered. No, darling, she said, her voice suddenly much softer. Let's have fun first. But I wasn't playing along anymore. Something about the look on their faces told me this wasn't just about the inheritance. There was something deeper, more desperate, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. I held the document in my hands, watching my mother's face carefully. I could see the nervousness creeping through her perfectly maintained composure. She was trying to hide it. But the tremor in her fingers, the brief flicker of her eyes, she was nervous. Val, please, she said in a voice that had a false sweetness to it. Let's just enjoy the evening. It's your special day. We don't need to get into business right now. But I couldn't ignore it. It was never just a casual chat when it came to matters of money. Especially in our family. I wasn't a fool. I had seen enough to know what they were capable of. And I had been the one cleaning up their messes for years. But not this time. This time, I was taking control. Mom, I said, sitting up straighter on the couch. This is important. I want to understand what this is before we go any further. You've dragged me here under the pretense of a party. And now there's legal paperwork on the table. It's not that simple. The room fell unnervingly quiet. My mother looked at my father, who seemed uncomfortable, and then at my brother, who stood there with his hands stuffed in his pockets, staring at the floor. I could see his unease. He was caught between loyalty to our parents and the reality of the situation. He knew, just as well as I did, that something didn't add up. What exactly am I looking at here? I asked again, my voice firmer now, the tension in the air palpable. My mother, for the first time, didn't have a quick response. She glanced at my father, who shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the whiskey in his hand as if it could give him some comfort. It's just a formality, Edmund said, attempting to sound casual, but the hesitation in his voice gave him away. A little bit of paperwork for Grandma Helen's estate. We're just tying up loose ends. Nothing urgent. I stared at him, then back at the document. A formality? Then why are we only seeing it now? And why is it sitting in the middle of a party that's supposed to be about me? I watched their faces, the wheels turning behind their eyes, recalculating their approach. They were used to me bending, used to me accepting whatever they put in front of me. But not anymore. No, darling, my mother said, her tone shifting from nervousness to a kind of practiced sweetness. You know how these things work. It's just some paperwork. Nothing for you to worry about. But the way she said it, I could hear the desperation in her voice. It was a thinly veiled plea to back off. To pretend I hadn't seen the title of the document and the look in her eyes when she realized I'd noticed. She wanted me to stay in the dark. To play along and ignore the obvious. To ignore what was right in front of me. I couldn't do that anymore. Tell me the truth, I said quietly, locking eyes with her. What's really going on here? The silence that followed was deafening. Edmund tried to intervene, raising his glass to offer some kind of distraction. But I wasn't going to let it go. This time, I was ready to confront whatever had been lurking beneath the surface all these years. I knew the truth was in that folder. And I wasn't going to walk away until I had it. What exactly are you asking me to sign? I demanded, my heart racing in my chest as I slid my finger under the seal of the document, slowly lifting it to reveal the full text. I could feel everyone's eyes on me now. The tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Just sign it, Val, Jasper finally spoke up, his voice filled with the kind of resignation that only came from years of watching our parents manipulate and control everything around us. They won't stop until you do. Please just sign it and let's get this over with. His words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't that I hadn't heard them before, but hearing my own brother speak as if this was the only choice I had, that this was the way things were meant to be, it stung. This wasn't just about money. It was about control, about the way they had drained me dry over the years, and how now they were trying to pull me into another trap. I shook my head slowly. No, Jasper, I'm not signing anything until I understand what this really means. I stood up, the document still clutched in my hand, my gaze sweeping across the room at the faces staring back at me. A few of them shifted uncomfortably, while others, like Aunt Margaret and Uncle Pete, were doing their best to look busy, pretending they weren't watching, but the tension in the room was too thick to ignore. They knew, just as I did, that the game was changing. Stop being difficult, Val, my mother snapped, her patience wearing thin. Just let it go. Don't make this harder than it has to be. But I was done letting things slide. Done being the family's fixer. This time, I was putting my foot down. I'm done being your personal bank account, I said, my voice steady but sharp. I'm done fixing your mistakes and cleaning up your mess. You're not going to manipulate me any longer. For the first time, I felt a sense of calm. It wasn't the nervous, unsure feeling I was so accustomed to when dealing with them. No. This was something different. This was power. The power that comes from finally saying no. The silence in the room was deafening. My mother's smile faltered, and I could see the desperation rising in her eyes. I wasn't going to back down. Not this time. The silence in the room seemed to stretch for an eternity. My mother, Susan, was no longer wearing her carefully crafted smile, the one that usually hid all the layers of manipulation beneath. Instead, her face had grown pale, her lips pressed tightly together, as if trying to force the words she wanted to say back into her mouth. Edmund, standing behind her, looked as if he were caught between two worlds, unsure whether to play the role of the loving father or the calculating schemer he had always been. Jasper, my brother, shuffled awkwardly near the fireplace, his usual air of detachment gone. He knew, as well as I did, that things had crossed a line. You don't understand, Val, Susan finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly, the veneer of calm cracking. Everything we've done for you, all of it, your father, me, your brother, it's for your future. I couldn't stop the laugh that escaped my lips. A bitter, hollow sound. For me? All this time, you've used me, you've taken from me, every time I've helped. It's never been about love. It's about control. It's about you getting what you want without giving anything in return. Edmund cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of authority. You don't know what it's like to be in our shoes. Samantha, we've had our share of struggles, too. You think everything's so simple for you because you have money and success. But we've had our own battles. We're just trying to protect you. Trying to make things right. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My father, who had gambled away every penny I had ever lent him, was now trying to sell me the idea that he was somehow looking out for me. The irony of it all made my stomach turn. And then there was Susan, with her endless list of emergencies and shopping sprees that always seemed to end in financial ruin. They had taken everything from me and called it love. You don't get to use that excuse anymore, I said, my voice cold, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. You've drained me emotionally, financially, you've kept me tied to you, like a puppet on a string. And now, you want to take what's mine, what Grandma left me. But you're not getting away with it this time. My mother flinched at my words. But I saw something shift in her eyes. For the first time, she looked afraid. She had always been the one in control, the one who manipulated every situation to her advantage. But now, for the first time, I wasn't backing down. I've had enough, I continued, my voice steady but filled with the conviction I had buried for years. You don't get to take what isn't yours. I'm not signing anything, and I'm not playing your game. The tension in the room was thick, and for a moment, it felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the explosion that was sure to come. And then, it did. Susan's face twisted with frustration. And she snapped. You ungrateful little girl. You think this is about money? This is about family. This is about protecting you. I met her gaze. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. To defend my actions. No, Mom. This is about control. And you've been controlling me for far too long. Not anymore. Jasper took a step forward, looking at me with wide eyes. But he didn't speak. I knew he was caught in the middle. Torn between the family he had always known and the sister who had always been there for him. But I couldn't afford to care anymore. Not when the stakes were this high. Please, he said quietly, his voice almost pleading. Just sign it. It'll all be over if you do. They won't stop until you do. I shook my head, the words slicing through the air like a dagger. No, I'm not going to let them win. Jasper, not this time. The words hung in the air, and I could see the disbelief in his eyes. But I knew, deep down, that he understood. He knew this wasn't about a piece of paper. It was about all the years I had spent cleaning up their messes, carrying their burdens. And now, for the first time, I was walking away. For good. The tension in the room was unbearable. But I didn't care anymore. I had made my decision. I was done being the family's fixer. And no matter what they said or did, I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into submission again. I'm done, I said, my voice low but final. I'm done being your safety net. I'm done being your ATM. And I'm done being your emotional punching bag. I'm taking control of my life. The room was silent now. And for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of peace. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to let them take it away from me. As I walked out of the room, the weight of the past few hours settled heavily on my shoulders. But for the first time in years, I felt free. My family, my parents, who had always seen me as nothing more than a resource to be drained, were left behind in the wreckage of their own making. I had done it. I had stood up for myself. For the first time in my life. The sun was setting as I stepped out into the cool evening air. And I could feel a strange sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't just about the inheritance or the family business. It was about breaking free from the toxic cycle that had defined my life for so long. I was finally letting go of the guilt, the resentment, and the false sense of responsibility I had carried for so many years. I dialed Reagan's number, and when she answered, I could hear the smile in her voice. How'd it go? She asked. It's done, I replied, my voice steady and sure. I'm done being their punching bag. I'm taking control of my life now. For real this time. We talked for a while, catching up on everything that had happened. But I knew that this was the beginning of something new for me. No more living in the shadows of my family's dysfunction. I was stepping into the light, ready to write my own story. As I hung up, I looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of peace settle in my chest. I had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that the strongest love sometimes means saying no. For more life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for new videos.